The Lost Generation. The term Lost Generation became widely known thanks to Ernest Hemingway in his book A Movable Feast, published after his death in 1964. This term refers to those born in the late 1800s, who lived through the end of the Belle Epoque and witnessed the preparations leading up to World War I, in which many of them fought. Growing up during that time meant facing war, a pandemic, tough economic times, and rapidly changing social conditions. World War I was particularly devastating for this generation. Over 70 million people were mobilized, with 8.5 million lives lost, and 21 million wounded. Additionally, 2 million soldiers succumbed to disease. Speaking of disease, the Spanish flu pandemic that swept through from 1918 to 1920 was another catastrophic event. Estimates of the death toll vary widely, with some suggesting between 17 to 50 million deaths globally, and others going as high as 100 million. Following the war and the pandemic, the world entered a period of economic instability, culminating in the Great Depression of the 1930s. This era saw soaring unemployment rates, widespread poverty, and a general atmosphere of despair. However, during these bleak times, popular culture began to emerge as a means of escape. Early cinema and magazines became outlets for people searching for relief from their harsh realities. In 1920, women in the United States gained the right to vote, and new job opportunities began to open up, especially for unmarried women, many of whom had been widowed by the war. The Greatest Generation, born between 1901 and 1927, these individuals are also known as the GI generation, a term that stands for government issue or general issue. Their experiences during the Great Depression instilled in them a deep sense of frugality, which they passed on to their children. News broadcaster Tom Brokaw honored them as the greatest in the late 90s, recognizing their moralistic approach to the hardships they faced. These individuals were deeply shaped by the challenges of the Great Depression following the 1929 Wall Street crash. Growing up in such tough times, they developed a strong sense of sacrifice, hard work, and patriotism, values that would define them throughout their lives. Often referred to as the World War II generation, they are celebrated for their heroism, technological innovation, and the prosperity they helped build. During their youth, significant advancements became commonplace, with the radio, telephone, and automobile becoming integral parts of daily life. This was also a golden era for culture and entertainment in America. The arts flourished, with literature, music, and cinema taking center stage. It was the beginning of Hollywood's golden age, with gangster films, musicals, comedies, and monster movies drawing huge crowds. Comic books also emerged during this time, introducing iconic characters like Superman and Batman. The music scene was vibrant, with genres like jazz, blues, gospel, folk, and swing jazz gaining widespread popularity. The radio played a pivotal role in shaping public opinion and connecting Americans, who eagerly tuned in to President Roosevelt's famous fireside chats to stay informed about national affairs. During World War II, 16 million Americans served, the majority of whom belonged to this generation. Remarkably, 38.8% of them volunteered, while 61.2% were drafted, serving an average of 33 months. As of now, nearly 120,000 of these veterans are still with us, a living testament to the resilience of this generation. The Silent Generation. The Silent Generation, born between 1928 and 1945, came of age in a world shaped by the aftermath of World War II and the dawn of the Cold War. Their parents had witnessed the fall of Nazism and now faced a new global threat: communism. As these children grew into adulthood after the war, they found themselves in a society struggling to rebuild and adapt to a new world order. With the Soviet Union reneging on post-war agreements, the global superpowers were locked in a tense standoff that would last for the next 50 years. Unlike the more outspoken generations before them, who sought to change the system, the Silent Generation was known for their approach of working within the system. They were diligent, kept their heads down, and focused on hard work. Their formative years were influenced by significant developments like the golden age of radio, the rise of trade unions, transatlantic flight, and the discovery of penicillin. This generation often married and started families at a young age, embracing a life of stability and modesty. However, Their tendency to avoid taking risks and their reluctance to challenge authority would later be criticized by the more radical baby boomers. The label silent stems from their general reluctance to protest or speak out against social issues, particularly during the McCarthy era, a time when government scrutiny and fear of communism were at their peak. The baby boomers. The term boomers comes from the massive population surge that occurred after World War II. This generation witnessed pivotal events such as the Cold War, the moon landing, the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and President John F. Kennedy, the Vietnam War, and the Civil Rights Movement. Boomers are often characterized by a sense of national optimism and a period of prosperous consumerism. Baby boomers, born from the late 1940s to the 1960s, were part of an era with an exceptionally high birth rate. 76 million births occurred during this time period. This surge was fueled by a strong post-war economy that gave Americans the confidence to raise large families. During this time, items that were once considered luxuries, such as washing machines, dishwashers, refrigerators, and telephones, became widely accessible to the average consumer. Technological advances, including plastics, television, magnetic tape, transistors, integrated circuits, and lasers, significantly improved the standard of living. This era of optimism also sparked a cultural boom, especially in the music industry, where artists like the Beatles, Bob Dylan, and the Rolling Stones gained immense popularity. However, not everything was smooth sailing. This period also saw intense political debates around issues like the sexual revolution, civil rights, nuclear weaponry, ethnic diversity, and environmental protection. The baby boomers were often more radical in their views, challenging conservative and traditionalist values. These ideological differences led to widespread protests, which sometimes turned violent, especially as the Vietnam War dragged on, leading to a growing sense of division and distrust in the government. Three key trends that shape generations, parenting, technology, and economics, are especially relevant for the baby boomers. Many boomers embraced the philosophy, "We want it to be easier for our kids than it was for us," which has influenced the parenting styles of subsequent generations. Generation X. The term Generation X was popularized by Canadian author and artist Douglas Copeland in his 1991 novel, Generation X, Tales for an Accelerated Culture. The X symbolizes a generation that remained somewhat hidden, numerically smaller than its predecessor, and often living in the shadow of the boomers. Generation X, also known as the latchkey generation, grew up in an era when many youngsters returned home from school to an empty house, frequently allowing themselves in with their own key. This was largely due to the rise in free-range parenting, higher divorce rates, more mothers entering the workforce, and the growing availability of childcare options outside the home. As these young adults matured, they became known as the MTV generation, sometimes labeled as slackers, cynical, and disaffected. The baby boom of the previous generation was followed by a significant drop in birth rates during the Gen X years, influenced by the introduction of the birth control pill in 1960 and the legalization of abortion in 1973. However, the demographic shifts brought by the 1965 Immigration Act helped offset this decline, making Gen X in America more culturally and ethnically diverse than ever before. In terms of culture, Generation X witnessed the rise of alternative rock, hip-hop, punk, post-punk, and heavy metal bands. The era was also marked by rapid technological innovation, with companies like Apple, Commodore, and Atari leading the way. Video games became a massive industry in the 1970s and 1980s, with arcades booming across the country and home consoles like those from Nintendo and Atari becoming household staples. Compared to the baby boomers, Gen Xers were more likely to pursue higher education, with college enrollment rates soaring during this period. Individualism and entrepreneurial spirit were among the defining traits of this generation, which later gave rise to companies like Google, Wikipedia, Amazon, and YouTube in the 90s and early 2000s. Baby boomers serve as a bridge between older and younger populations, having been present at the birth of the internet, video games, and artificial intelligence, and many of them were directly involved in creating these advances. Generation Y. Millennials. Millennials, also known as Generation Y, are often recognized as the first generation to grow up with the internet, mobile technology, and social media. Millennials are currently between the ages of 28 and 42. The term millennials was coined because they reached adulthood around the turn of the millennium. The term was introduced by American sociologists William Strauss and Neil Howe, who have written extensively on generational theory. This makes them the first truly global generation, constantly connected to the world. However, they've also been called the unluckiest generation, facing slower economic growth compared to previous generations. Many have been burdened by significant student debt and high childcare costs, which have affected their financial stability. A key trait of this group is that they personally remember the events of September 11th, were active participants in the rise of the internet, and faced significant financial struggles due to the Great Recession. Born during a time of declining fertility rates worldwide, millennials are having fewer children than their predecessors. Young adults in the 2010s were often critiqued for having less sexual activity compared to earlier generations at the same age. This generation is also less likely to be religious than those before them. Millennials are noted for their digital skills, diversified opinions, and great social consciousness. Growing up in an era where worldwide news and information are easily accessible, they are extremely socially and politically active, and they are not hesitant to speak up. Generation Z, Zoomers. Generation Z, also known as iGen, is more racially and ethnically diverse, better educated, and more open to non-traditional identities than those before them. With the rise of social media, the worsening climate crisis, and the increase in mass shooting violence, Gen Z is seen as the most mentally strained generation. While they share some similarities with millennials, there are key differences. Millennials were introduced to the internet and smartphones during their formative years and had to adapt quickly to a rapidly changing world. In contrast, Zoomers were born into this digital environment. They have grown up amid social justice movements, intense political changes, such as the rise of Donald Trump, the Black Lives Matter protests, and a pandemic that disrupted their high school and college experiences. Additionally, Zoomers are deeply embedded in the attention and dopamine-driven economy, with platforms like YouTube and TikTok not only shaping how they consume information, but also influencing what information is pushed to the public. Even memes, which started as simple jokes among millennials, have evolved into powerful tools for spreading and popularizing ideas. Individualism is a defining trait of Gen Z, much like it was for Gen X. The internet has revitalized the entrepreneurial spirit, with freelancing and gig economy jobs reshaping how work is conducted. Zoomers are a unique group. They were the first to deal with the challenges of cyberbullying and other internet-related issues, and they faced rising concerns about school violence and the climate crisis. Generation Alpha. Social researcher Mark McCrindle coined the term Generation Alpha to signify a fresh start after Generation Z. McCrindle predicts that this generation will grow up with more diverse family dynamics, greater racial diversity, and higher economic inequality than their predecessors. The oldest among them are just 9 years old, making them the first generation to be entirely born in the 21st century. Generation Alpha, the youngest group, is still too young to fully understand what the future holds for them. Mostly raised by millennials, they've been nicknamed the pandemic generation because they experienced the COVID-19 pandemic during their formative years. Growing up in a world where technology plays a central role, these children are living in a time of rapid change in education and entertainment. Often referred to as iPad kids, they spend less time with their parents compared to previous generations and are becoming more independent and self-guided. Generation Alpha is expected to face unique challenges, including mental health issues, misinformation, and increasing polarization. According to the United Nations, members of this generation could have an average global lifespan of 83 years. Climate activism is particularly strong among these younger generations, who are increasingly taking concrete steps to advocate for change. They are pushing for renewable energy, the electrification of transportation, and the adoption of circular economy practices as part of their broader commitment to a sustainable future. As Generation Alpha continues to grow, they will likely carry these concerns with them, shaping the world in ways we can only begin to imagine. With nearly 2 billion members expected by 2025, their impact on the global stage is sure to be significant.